The dumb fucking aliens were about to find out the hard way. Don't fuck with humans, unless you want your shit absolutely wrecked. Aboard the massive alien space station orbiting a distant gas giant, Scott Gordon was the sole human among thousands of extraterrestrials. The 28-year-old mechanic from Earth was there to do a job, fix the station's malfunctioning airlock doors and life support systems. But as he worked, an ear-splitting alarm suddenly blared throughout the facility. Scott looked up from his tools to see a squad of armed Idosian guards storming toward him, led by Janus, the beefy head of station security. Before Scott could even ask what the hell was going on, the guards grabbed him roughly and started dragging him away. "Hey, what the fuck?" Scott yelled, struggling against their iron grips. But the aliens just snarled at him to shut up. They hauled Scott into a dimly lit interrogation room and shoved him into a chair. Janus loomed over him menacingly. "Human, you stand accused of sabotaging this station's critical systems," Janus growled. "We have evidence of your crimes." "What? That's bullshit," Scott protested. "I'm here to fix your damn station, not destroy it. I didn't do anything." "The evidence is clear," Janus declared, "and as the only human in Idosian space, you have no rights. For your acts of terrorism against this station, I sentence you to immediate execution." Scott's stomach dropped as the horrible realization hit him. He was about to be killed for something he didn't do, with no way to prove his innocence or get help, surrounded by hostile aliens eager to see him dead for their own twisted reasons. He was utterly alone and helpless. The guards punched and kicked him viciously, beating him bloody, then dragged his limp body through the corridors toward an airlock. Scott knew what came next. They were going to space him and let the merciless vacuum of the void squeeze the life out of him as he suffocated. As the airlock cycled open to the infinite black abyss dotted with stars, Scott lifted his head weakly, blood trickling from his mouth. He cracked a small, defiant grin at Janus and spoke his final, sarcastic words. "I always knew you aliens were afraid of us. Guess I was right," he coughed. As he careened away from the station, choking, freezing, and feeling his consciousness fading, Scott had one final thought. "Fucking aliens, they'll regret this. Humanity won't let this stand. We'll annihilate those scaly dickbags." Then everything went black. The void of space engulfed Scott as he tumbled ass over tea kettle away from the station's airlock. His lungs seized, instinctively trying to hold his breath before he remembered his suit still had air. His heart pounded in his ears as he forced himself to breathe. "Okay, don't panic," he muttered to himself. "You're not dead yet." Scott's hands shook as he fumbled with the suit controls, finally finding the thrusters. He fired them in short bursts, slowly stabilizing his wild spin until the station stopped careening crazily across his vision. He rotated to face back toward the airlock, and his blood boiled. Janus was standing in the viewport, a smug grin on his scaly face, clearly savoring watching Scott's final moments. The bastard really thought he'd won. Scott's eyes desperately scanned the station's exterior until he spotted it. The maintenance airlock he'd just fixed, only about 100 meters away. A crazy idea burst into his adrenaline-addled brain. Carefully angling his thrusters, Scott started propelling himself toward the airlock, trying to keep his movements small to conserve fuel. It felt like forever as he drifted closer, the airlock growing larger in his vision. Finally, he grabbed onto the edge of the door, arresting his momentum. His gloved hands scrambled across the smooth metal until he found the access panel. Ripping it open, he stared at the crisscrossing wires inside. "Come on, come on," he muttered frantically, tracing the circuits until he found the right connections. He hastily spliced and rerouted the wiring to override the normal airlock controls. Klaxons started blaring, and lights flashed as the outer airlock door ground open, the station's atmosphere venting out in a violent gust. Scott felt his oxygen rapidly depleting as he kicked and clawed his way inside, hitting the inner door control with the last of his strength. The inner door slid shut, and air flooded back in as Scott collapsed to the floor, breathing heavily. He ripped off his helmet, sweat-soaked hair plastered to his forehead. Staggering to his feet, he lurched over to a maintenance terminal. His fingers flew over the controls with practiced ease, calling up systems he wasn't supposed to have access to. All right, time to let the folks back home know what these scaly freaks tried to pull. Fingers shaking with anger and adrenaline, Scott punched in the coordinates for the nearest human outpost and recorded his message. This is Scott Gordon. I've been framed for sabotage and attempted murder by the Adoshan security officer Janus. Humans are not safe here. Send help immediately. He encrypted the transmission and sent it bursting out into the void. Heart still racing, he quickly scrubbed any trace of his intrusion from the system logs. Hearing shouts and thudding boots in the distance, Scott ducked out of the room and slipped away into the bowels of the station. He stuck to narrow access corridors and maintenance hatches, heading for the industrial sections where he could disappear among the noisy machinery. "You goddamn aliens haven't seen the last of me," he growled under his breath as he vanished into the shadows. "You fucked with the wrong species." Scott curled up in the tight confines of the maintenance shaft, straining his ears for any hint of footsteps or voices. The metal walls pressed in around him as he held his breath, praying the Adoshan security goons would pass by without noticing his hiding spot. After several tense minutes, their heavy tread and guttural language faded into the distance. He knew his desperate plea for help was hurtling through space towards the human outpost, but it would take weeks to arrive, and even if they sent a rescue ship immediately, it would still be a long haul back. Scott was on his own, and he needed to survive until help could arrive. Cautiously poking his head out, Scott scanned the dimly lit corridor for any sign of movement. Seeing none, he slipped out of his hiding place, wincing as his stiff muscles protested. He crept along the passageway, ducking into alcoves whenever he heard a noise. His stomach growled painfully, reminding him that he hadn't eaten in over a day. Scott made his way towards the station's main storerooms, keeping to the shadows. As he approached the entrance, he spotted 2 Adoshan guards standing watch. After an intense 15 minutes of dodging patrols and hacking door locks, Scott finally managed to sneak into a small supply closet adjoining the main stores. He stuffed his pockets with nutrient bars and filled a pouch with water pouches, grabbing only what he could carry easily. Just as he was about to sneak back out, Scott heard voices approaching. He froze, then quickly ducked behind a stack of crates. 2 Adoshan technicians entered the room, still talking. "Can't believe the human scum is still loose on the station. I thought Janus said he'd spaced him." He escaped somehow. Probably had help from some other human-loving traitors. You know how sneaky their kind are." Scott gritted his teeth, knuckles whitening as he clenched his fists. "You bastards don't know the half of it," he thought angrily. The Adoshans continued grumbling as they grabbed some tools and left. Scott let out a tense breath and crept from the room. He needed a more secure hideout. For the next several day cycles on the station, Scott survived by hiding in ventilation ducts, sneaking through maintenance tubes, and stealing small amounts of food and water when he could. He narrowly evaded detection from the increasingly frustrated Adoshan security forces and their surveillance drones. Sleep-deprived and twitchy with constant adrenaline, Scott grew more desperate. Hacking a console, he pored over schematics of the station, searching for any advantage. During one of these illicit sessions, the sound of heavy footsteps in the corridor sent a jolt of panic through him. Scott smashed the door lock behind him and fled down a narrow access shaft. He slid down a ladder and turned to sprint away, only to crash headlong into a metal strut. Pain exploded across his brow as he collapsed in a dazed heap. Warmth trickled into his eye, and he swiped at it, his hand coming away smeared with blood. "Ah, hell," Scott groaned, probing the gash on his forehead. It wasn't life-threatening, but it hurt like a bitch. The near miss left him shaken. He stumbled away, looking for a dark corner to hide and tend his wound. As he huddled in the shadows, wrapping a makeshift bandage around his head, the reality of his situation sank in. He couldn't run forever. This place was too big, with too many Adoshans hunting him. He needed help, allies, another plan. Over the next days, in between dodging security sweeps, Scott took to observing the various species on the station. The Adocians strutted about importantly, barking orders at other races. Most notably, they seemed to reserve special derision for the Crythians, an insectoid-like species that seemed to make up most of the station's menial labor force. Scott watched from catwalks and through grates as the tall mantis-like aliens toiled away, only to be berated, shoved, and smacked by their Adocian overseers for the slightest perceived fault. The more he saw, the more his simmering anger grew. Late one night cycle, Scott lurked in an overlooking ventilation shaft as a group of Crythians worked to repair a malfunctioning plasma conduit. As one of the alien workers struggled to lift a heavy spanner wrench, a Adocian foreman roughly backhanded him, sending him crashing to the floor. The other Crythians flinched, huddling together fearfully as the foreman ranted at them. Something snapped inside Scott. This was too much. Before he quite realized what he was doing, he was dropping from the ceiling, landing in a crouch between the foreman and the fallen Crythian. The Adocian overseer stumbled backwards in shock, eyes widening as he took in the wild-eyed, filthy, bloody human before him. The Crythians shrank back in surprise and fear. "Please, I need your help," he said slowly, keeping his voice calm and unthreatening. "I'm trying to get off this station, to get away from the Adocians. I can help you escape, too." "I know you're afraid. I know they treat you like shit," Scott continued, jerking his head contemptuously toward the Adocian foreman who still cowered behind him. "You don't deserve this. None of us do. We have to get out of here." There was a long, tense pause. Then one of the Crythians, the one who'd been struck, stepped forward. He nervously extended one of his long, segmented forelimbs. "I am Zurich," he said haltingly. "We will help you, human, if you help us be free." Over the next week, Scott and his small group of Crythian allies snuck through seldom-used corridors and maintenance tubes, avoiding Adocian security forces. The insectoids, with their knowledge of the station's layout from their labor duties, guided Scott to hiding spots he never would have found on his own. The unlikely band quietly stockpiled meager supplies, stolen rations, tools that could be used as weapons, a few precious oxygen canisters. Scott used his technical skills to slice into the station's systems when he could, trying to remotely disable security sensors along their planned escape route. "We're almost ready," Scott whispered to Zyrek and the others as they huddled in a dimly lit cargo bay. "I've been watching the schedules. There's a small transport ship docking in Bay 94 tomorrow, offloading some machine parts. If we can get aboard, I can have us detached and away before the Adocians know what hit 'em." The Crythians nodded solemnly, compound eyes glittering in the low light. They knew what was at stake, freedom or death. Just as Scott finished outlining the plan, there was a sudden clang from the far side of the bay. The group froze, mandibles and hands clenching reflexively. A single Crythian, one of the youngest, stepped out from behind a pallet of crates. I am sorry," he clicked, not meeting their eyes. "I had to—" Before they could react, a stun grenade flew from the shadows, exploding in a flash of blinding light and nerve-frying sound. Scott and the Crythians collapsed, twitching and disoriented. Adocian security teams boiled into the room, shock prods and stasis cuffs at the ready. Scott tried to shake off the effects of the grenade and frantically crawl away, but a neural whip lashed around his legs, sending him crashing to the deck. Through blurred, watering eyes, Scott saw the Crythians roughly grabbed and dragged away, their weakened struggles futile. The traitorous young Crythian stood to the side, head bowed, as the Adocian officer clapped him on the shoulder approvingly. "Good work, drone. You will be rewarded for your service in capturing these dissidents." Seething with impotent rage and despair, Scott slowly raised his gaze to the Adocian officer standing over him. A grim, cruel smile spread across the alien's face. "Did you really think you could turn our own workers against us, human?" the Adocian sneered. "You and those bugs will pay the price for such treachery." The alien raised his shock prod, and agony exploded through Scott's body. The world went black as he convulsed on the deck. When Scott regained consciousness, he was alone in a tiny, featureless cell, his body aching and twitching with the after-effects of the neural assault. He dragged himself to a sitting position, despair washing over him. His one shot at help had failed. Because of him, the Crythians were captured, probably being interrogated and tortured right now. He'd failed them, just like he'd failed to see through the Adoshan's deception in the first place. He was still alone, still trapped, and Janice would be coming for him again soon, this time with no plans for a quick execution. Scott buried his head in his hands, hopelessness threatening to overwhelm him. He'd gambled everything on this escape plan, and he'd lost. The human outpost probably hadn't even received his message yet. He was out of ideas, out of options, out of hope. Scott lay on the cold metal floor of his cell, despair threatening to crush him. The betrayal of the young Crithian and the capture of his allies weighed heavily on his soul. He had failed them all. But as he wallowed in self-pity, a spark of defiance flickered to life in his chest. No, he refused to let it end like this. If he was going down, he would go down fighting. Scott dragged himself to his feet, ignoring the pain racking his body. He began to pace, his mind racing. He needed a plan, a way to strike back at Janus and the Adoshans. Hours turned into days, as Scott meticulously recalled every detail he could about the station's layout and security systems. He'd spent weeks crawling through every hidden maintenance shaft and access tunnel. He knew this place better than anyone. Slowly, a plan began to take shape, a desperate, reckless gambit. But it was all he had left. On the night he'd selected for his raid, Scott feigned illness, drawing the guard into his cell. As soon as the Adosian bent over him, Scott lashed out, striking like a coiled viper. A few desperate seconds of struggling, and the guard lay unconscious at his feet. Scott quickly stripped the guard of his uniform and identity badge, his heart hammering against his ribs. He activated the door and stepped out into the corridor, trying to effect the purposeful stride of a security officer. Scott's intimate knowledge of the station's systems allowed him to slip through gaps in the surveillance network, steadily making his way towards the command sector, towards Janus. He found himself standing before the door to Janus's office, the metal portal seeming to loom over him. Scott reached into the stolen uniform, retrieving the plasma cutter he'd lifted from a maintenance locker. The brilliant beam sliced through the locking mechanism like it was butter. Scott's fingers danced across the touchscreen, lines of code flickering before his eyes. He muttered curses under his breath, sweat beading on his forehead. There had to be something here, some evidence he could use to clear his name. But what he found was so much worse. Files, documents, and schematics filled the screen, details of a fleet being assembled, of invasion plans and bombardment targets. The Adoshans weren't just planning to subjugate the station, they were going to invade human space, and Scott had played right into their hands. Janus's plot to frame him, the sabotage, all of it, it was meant to provoke the humans, to justify the war the Adoshans craved. Scott felt sick. He had to get this information out, had to warn humanity. He reached for his stolen identity badge, intending to download the files. The doors suddenly hissed open behind him. Scott spun, dread coiling in his gut. "Did you really think you could outsmart me, human?" Janus's voice dripped with contempt. "You've played your part perfectly. When the humans come for you, they'll find an armada waiting for them." Janus was still gloating, savoring his victory. "Your message will bring your people to us like lambs to slaughter. By the time they arrive, this station will be—" Scott moved, a blur of desperate speed. He lunged at Janus, grappling for the Adosian sidearm. Janus snarled in surprise, his grip on the weapon faltering. Scott wrenched it free, jamming the barrel under the alien's scaly chin. "Back off!" Scott roared at the guards, hauling Janus in front of him like a shield. "Drop the weapons or I paint the walls with his brains." The Adosians hesitated, looking to their leader for guidance. Janus, to his credit, only gurgled in incoherent rage, Scott's forearm locked around his windpipe. Scott backed towards the door, dragging Janus with him. The guards parted reluctantly, unwilling to risk their commander's life. Then Scott was in the corridor, alarms shrieking to life around him as he hauled Janus along. He had no idea where he was going, no real plan. He only knew he had to keep moving, had to find some way to escape to survive. The fate of humanity itself hung in the balance. Scott dragged Janus down the corridors, the alien commander's feet scrabbling against the deck. Edosian guards scattered before them, unwilling to risk their leader. The guards hesitated, but a snarl from Janus sent them scurrying to comply. Scott hauled his hostage into the cavernous hangar, eyes darting between the guards and the shuttlecraft powering up on the launch pad. Suddenly, movement flickered in the shadows. Scott tensed, expecting an ambush. But instead of Edosian reinforcements, a group of Crythians emerged, led by a familiar face, the one who had betrayed Scott. Before Scott could react, the insectoids surged forward, vibroblades flashing. They fell upon the Edosian guards, exoskeletons clattering, ichor spraying. In moments, the guards lay twitching on the deck. The lead Crythian approached Scott, hands raised placatingly. "I am sorry, friend Scott. The betrayal, it was necessary. To lower their guard, yes?" Scott blinked, mind racing to catch up. The Crythians had been on his side all along? He nodded slowly. "All right. Okay. Let's get on that shuttle." The unlikely band hurried up the ramp, Scott shoving Janus ahead of him. He sealed the hatch as the Crythians took up guard positions. "You're coming with us," Scott growled to Janus, binding the alien's wrists with a zip tie. "Gonna need some insurance." Janus only glared murderously as Scott dumped him into a seat. Scott slid into the pilot's chair, hands flying over the controls. The shuttle hummed to life around them. Suddenly the hangar doors exploded inward. Edosian troops poured through the smoking hole, energy weapons spitting blue fire. The shuttle's hull rang with the impacts. The Crythians returned fire from the open hatch, insectoid battle cries rising over the din. "Go, friend Scott," the leader shouted. "We will cover you." Scott punched the thrusters, the sudden acceleration slamming him back into his seat. The shuttle leaped from the deck, nose angling for the stars visible through the breach. Just as they cleared the hangar, a missile streaked from the Edosian ranks. It struck the blasted doors, igniting the mangled metal in a massive secondary explosion. The blast hammered the fleeing shuttle, sending it spinning like a leaf on a hurricane wind. Behind him the Crythians cheered, mandibles clicking in celebration. They had done it. They were free. Their joy was short-lived. Janus, forgotten in the chaos, lunged from his seat with a roar. He slammed into Scott, scrabbling for the controls. The shuttle careened crazily as the two grappled trading blows, neither willing to release their hold. The Crythians chittered in alarm, unsure how to intervene without sending the craft into a fatal spin. Scott reared back and cracked his head forward, slamming his forehead into Janus's face. The Edosian reeled back, green blood spraying from his shattered snout. Seizing his chance, Scott grabbed Janus by the collar and slammed him face-first into the instrument panel. Once, twice, 3 times, until the struggling alien finally went limp. Scott heaved Janus's unconscious form aside, chest heaving. His head swam as he reached for the controls, the shuttle still shuddering and alarms still blaring. With shaking hands, he inputted the coordinates for the human outpost, praying the abused craft could make the journey. The computer flashed an estimated time to arrival. Light years, weeks at this rate. Scott collapsed back into the pilot's seat. They had escaped the immediate danger. But with a damaged shuttle, a skeleton crew, and a scheming alien warlord for a prisoner, Scott knew their fight was far from over. Scott coughed, a stabbing pain lancing through his chest as he hauled himself upright in the pilot's chair. Smoke filled the shuttle's cockpit, acrid and thick. He blinked, trying to clear his blurred vision. "Everyone all right back there?" A chorus of clicks and chirps answered him as the Crythians picked themselves up, shaken but alive. Scott stumbled to the rear compartment, his head pounding. Zyrik bent over one of his comrades, wrapping a makeshift bandage around a bleeding gash. He looked up at Scott's approach. "Some injuries, but we will live. The shuttle, not so much." Scott nodded grimly, examining the flickering control panels. "Yeah, she's done for. Comms are fried, engines are toast, but at least we put some distance between us and that warship." A groan drew his attention. Janus slouched in the corner, his arms bound. The Adosian glared at Scott, blood trickling from a cut on his brow. "You're only delaying the inevitable, human." Scott crouched down, meeting Janus's gaze. "Maybe, but every second we buy is another chance for my people to get our warning, to stop your little invasion before it starts." Janus sneered, his split lip twisting. "You're delusional. As soon as the flagship catches up to us, you're all dead." Scott straightened, turning back to Xyrek. "Then we better get moving." He brought up the shuttle's flickering scanners, studying the readouts. "There's a lot of raw materials in these asteroids. Metals, minerals. If we can salvage some components from the shuttle, might be able to cobble together a jury-rigged comms array." Xyrek peered over his shoulder. "We'll need to work quickly. Warship will not be far behind." Scott nodded, already gathering tools. "Then let's get cracking." The next hours passed in a frantic blur of activity. Scott and the able-bodied Crithians ventured out onto the asteroid's surface, magnetic boots clamping onto the nickel-iron rock. They scavenged what they could from the shuttle's wreckage, hauling back twisted pieces of metal and tangles of wiring. In the gutted cargo hold, Scott worked feverishly, his suit's headlamp casting stark shadows. His hands moved with practiced surety, stripping components and splicing connections. Slowly, a ramshackle communications array began to take shape. Telukrik ducked into the hold, his carapace scratched and dented. Patrols have spotted the warship's lights in the distance. They will be in weapons range soon. Scott wiped sweat from his eyes, not looking up from his soldering. "Almost there, just need a few more minutes." Suddenly the asteroid shuddered, nearly knocking them off their feet. Scott scrambled to the cockpit viewport. The Adosian flagship loomed above them, its hull guns unleashing a barrage on the surrounding asteroids. Massive chunks of rock exploded into fragments, pelting the shuttle's hull like shrapnel. "They're trying to flush us out," Scott growled. "Can't risk blasting us directly without confirming the kill." Xyrek clicked his mandibles nervously. "What do we do?" Scott turned back to the comms array, his jaw set. "We get this thing working, it's our only shot." His fingers flew over the controls, rerouting power from the shuttle's fading reserves. The array hummed to life, indicator lights blinking. Scott input the coordinates for the human outpost, his hand hovering over the transmit key. Another bombardment rocked the asteroid closer this time. Dust and debris rattled down from the shuttle's ceiling. Janus, still bound in the corner, laughed harshly. "Tick-tock, human. You're out of time." Scott met Xyrek's gaze, seeing the same desperate determination reflected back. He nodded once, then slammed his hand down on the transmit key. A burst of static erupted from the array's speakers, then resolved into a crackling voice. "Outpost Zeta, receiving your signal. Boost. Power." Scott grabbed the mic. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Scott Gordon, authentication code Epsilon 9 Foxtrot. The Adosians are planning to invade human space, I repeat. The Adosians are planning to invade. We need immediate assistance, do you copy?" A tense pause, then blessedly a response. "Copy, Gordon, invasion confirmed, mobilizing forces. What, your status?" Scott breathed a sigh of relief, even as another explosion shook the shuttle. "We're in an asteroid field pinned down by an Adosian warship, sending coordinates now. We'll hold out as long as we can, but—" Her deafening boom cut him off. The entire asteroid heaved, cracks splitting its surface. The shuttle groaned, tilting precariously on the edge of a widening chasm. Scott braced himself against the console, the mic still clutched in his hand. "Outpost Zeta, our position is compromised. The asteroid is destabilizing. We're going to have to abandon the shuttle." The response was garbled, lost in a haze of interference as the asteroid shook itself apart. Scott staggered to the rear of the shuttle, Xyrek close behind. The Crithians were already gathering what meager supplies they could carry. Scott hauled Janus to his feet, the Adosian stumbling in his restraints. "Looks like you're coming with us. Can't have you calling for help now, can we?" Janus spat a curse, but fear shone in his eyes as the shuttle's hull screeched and buckled around them. Scott shoved him towards the airlock, the Crithians crowding in behind. The outer door ground open, revealing a hellscape of tumbling rock and blinding explosions. The Adosian warship hung in the distance, its guns still firing relentlessly. All right, everyone, stick close, stay low, and whatever you do, don't stop moving. With a deep breath, Scott plunged out into the maelstrom, his unlikely band of survivors close behind. The shattered remains of the asteroid spun away into the void, the twisted wreckage of the shuttle soon lost among the chaos. And high above, the Adosian warship prowled, its searchlight sweeping the debris field, hunting for any sign of its elusive quarry. The battle was far from over, but the first shots had been fired. The human outpost knew the truth now. Scott could only hope they would reach them in time. He gritted his teeth and pushed onward, leaping from one hurtling chunk of rock to the next. They had to keep moving, had to stay alive. Scott grunted as he hauled himself out of the wrecked shuttle, sharp pains lancing through his battered body. The Crithians crawled out behind him, their exoskeletons scuffed and cracked. They gathered what meager supplies they could salvage from the smoking ruin. Zyric limped over, one forelimb hanging at an unnatural angle. "We cannot stay here, friend Scott. The warship will find us." Scott nodded, wincing as he shouldered a pack of rations. "There." He pointed to a dark cleft in the asteroid's rocky surface. "Looks like a cave system. Might buy us some time to regroup." They staggered towards the opening, the ominous silhouette of the Adosian warship looming in the starry void above. As they slipped into the shadowy tunnels, Scott did a quick head count. His stomach dropped. "Where's Janus?" The Crithians buzzed and clicked, searching the group, but the Adosian was nowhere to be seen. "He must have slipped away during the crash," Zyric chittered grimly. "He will bring the soldiers." "We need to set a trap. How fast can you dig?" The insectoid's mandibles twitched in what passed for a smile. "Faster than you, human." Over the next few hours, the Crithians tunneled through the asteroid's porous rock with astonishing speed, their clawed limbs churning through stone like it was loose soil. They carved out a maze of interlocking passages and dead-end chambers. Meanwhile, Scott pried open the shuttle's battered power cells, carefully extracting the volatile energy cores. His hands shook as he wired the makeshift charges, all too aware of the destructive potential he held. He placed the explosives at key structural points Zyric had identified, camouflaging them with rubble. Each charge was linked to a remote detonator on Scott's wristcom. The stage was set. Sensors on Scott's suit picked up multiple life signs approaching the cave entrance. Adosians, led by a smug Janus. The Adosians froze at the sound, then surged forward, plasma rifles at the ready. They charged into the tunnels, Janus at their head. "Find the human!" Janus snarled, his voice thick with rage and humiliation. "Flush him out!" Scott watched on his visor's HUD as the soldiers spread out through the labyrinth. He waited until they were committed, dozens of heat signatures worming deeper into the asteroid. Then he keyed the detonator. The world shook as the explosives went off in a rippling cascade of blasts. The tunnels collapsed in on themselves, tons of rock crashing down in clouds of pulverized dust. Screams of anger and pain echoed through the passages before being abruptly cut off. Scott's suit automatically compensated for the overpressure wave, keeping him on his feet as he sprinted through the shuddering tunnel. According to his HUD, over half the Adosian forces had been trapped or buried in the cave-ins. But a handful of signatures still moved through the rubble-choked passages, converging on his location, and leading them was Janus. Scott ducked into a larger chamber, loose stones clattering under his boots. He spun to face the tunnel entrance just as Janus emerged from the swirling dust, uniform torn and smeared with blood. The Adosian's eyes blazed with barely contained fury. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Janus hissed, stalking forward. "But you're just delaying the inevitable." "I don't know," Scott shot back, circling to keep distance between them. "Blowing up half your squad seems pretty damn clever to me." Janus roared and lunged, a vibroblade glinting in his grip. Scott barely got his forearm up in time to block the slash, the blade sparking off his suit's armor. They grappled in the close confines, trading blows and crashing into the chamber walls. The entire asteroid seemed to shudder and groan around them as they fought, the structural damage taking its toll. Janus was relentless, his rage lending him strength. Scott took a punishing blow to the ribs, feeling something crack. He staggered back, gasping. The Adosian grinned savagely and pressed his advantage, hammering at Scott's weakening defense. The human was driven to one knee, barely holding back the vibroblade as it edged towards his throat. Just then a massive tremor rocked the chamber. Janus stumbled, his balance faltering for just an instant, but it was enough. Scott surged upward, smashing his helmet into Janus's jaw. As the Adosian reeled back, Scott unleashed a vicious combination of strikes, targeting joint and nerve clusters with brutal precision. Janus toppled, his blade clattering away. Scott scooped it up and pressed the humming edge to the Adosian's throat. "Stay down," he growled. "It's over." As if on cue, Zyric and the other Crithians emerged from side tunnels, the battered forms of the remaining Adosian soldiers slung over their shoulders. "The soldiers are neutralized," Zyric reported, dumping his unconscious burden to the floor. "But the warship still looms. We must contact your people. Warn them." Scott nodded, his breath coming in pained gasps. He looked down at Janus's glowering form. "Looks like we'll need to send a message, and I know just how to do it." Minutes later, they were gathered around the gutted remains of the shuttle. Zyric and his kin worked feverishly, their claws deftly stripping away damaged components from the communications array. The Crithians' innate knowledge of mineralogy and electromagnetic propagation proved invaluable. They showed Scott how to tune the transmitter to the asteroid's unique composition, using the rock itself as a signal amplifier and directional antenna. As they jury-rigged the final connections, a deep, unsettling rumble shook the tunnel. Pebbles rained down from the ceiling, pattering off their suits. "The asteroid is destabilizing," Zyric warned, his faceted eyes wide. "The damage from the explosives and the crash." Scott gritted his teeth, fingers flying over the improvised controls. "Almost got it." A crack split the chamber wall, venting a geyser of superheated gas and debris. Scott flinched back from the scalding blast, shielding his faceplate. The temperature in his suit spiked dangerously. "Scott," Zyric shouted over the rising roar, "we must leave now." "Just need to calibrate the frequency," Scott yelled back, hunched over the sparking array. Sweat poured down his face inside his helmet. More fissures ruptured open, the asteroid shaking itself apart. Noxious geysers burst from the tunnel floor, threatening to engulf them. With a final desperate keystroke, Scott locked in the signal and slammed his fist on the transmit key. A powerful burst of tight beam radiation lanced out from the array, the electromagnetic pulse resonating through the asteroid's crystalline structure and out into the void. The message, a desperate plea for aid and a dire warning of invasion, rocketed towards the distant human outpost, a whisper against the darkness of space. Scott could only pray it would be heard in time. "It's sent!" He pushed himself away from the crumbling console, grabbing the unconscious Janus by the collar. "Go, go!" They ran, stumbling and leaping through the disintegrating tunnels. The asteroid bucked and heaved around them, massive slabs of rock shearing away into space. Ahead, Zyric wrenched open the hatch of a small escape pod, beckoning frantically. Scott and the other Crithians piled in, dragging Janus's limp form with them. The hatch sealed and the pod blasted free, scant seconds before the tunnel collapsed in a roar of tortured stone and escaping atmosphere. The tiny craft tumbled away into the void, the shattered remains of the asteroid spinning away behind them. In the cramped confines of the pod, Scott slumped against the wall, his whole body one giant ache. The Crithians clung to handholds, their insectoid bodies battered but unbroken. Janus lay bound and unconscious at their feet, a valuable prisoner. And in the distance, the Adosian warship cruised closer, a prowling predator in the night. Scott closed his eyes, exhaustion and pain dragging at him. The pod was adrift, its propulsion spent, their fate in the hands of chance and a desperate transmission. All they could do now was wait, and hope that their message had been heard. That help would come before the Adosians found them again. The pod tumbled onward through the stars, a fragile mote lost in the cold, uncaring depths of space. The escape pod drifted through the asteroid field, its hull creaking and groaning under the stress. Inside, Scott and the Crithians slumped in their seats, battered and exhausted. Janus, trussed up in the corner, glared at them with defiant rage. Suddenly, a shrill beep from the pod's sensors jolted them to attention. A ship was approaching fast. The Crithians tensed, mandibles clicking nervously. "Could be Adoshan reinforcements," Xeric said, voice strained. "They found us." But as Scott peered at the scanner readout, a grin spread across his face. "No, that's no Adoshan ship, that's a human frigate." The Crithians buzzed with surprise and relief as the frigate loomed into view, its angular hull bristling with weapons. A tractor beam lanced out, enveloping the battered escape pod and reeling it in. Minutes later, Scott and the Crithians stood on the frigate's hangar deck, blinking under the bright lights. A squad of armed humans surrounded them, weapons at the ready. A tall woman with close-cropped hair and a captain's insignia strode forward, her sharp gaze taking in the bedraggled group. "I'm Captain Alara Vance. Who are you and what the hell is going on?" Scott stepped forward, ignoring his body's screaming protests. "Captain Vance, I'm Scott Gordon. We sent the transmission. The Adoshans, they're planning to invade human space." Vance's eyes narrowed. She gestured to her men. "Get them to the medbay, post a guard on the Adoshan, and you," she locked eyes with Scott, "start talking." An hour later, in the frigate's briefing room, Scott finished recounting his harrowing tale. Captain Vance and her officers listened intently, expressions grim. Scott leaned forward, wincing as his ribs twinged. "Captain, I downloaded evidence from Janus's computer. Invasion plans, fleet dispositions, everything. The Adoshans are going to hit the human outpost first. We have to warn them." Vance nodded curtly. "Helm, set a course for the outpost, maximum speed." She turned back to Scott. "You've done well, Gordon. We'll take it from here." As the frigate hurtled through hyperspace, Scott paced restlessly. They had Janus in the brig, but the stubborn bastard refused to talk. An idea sparked in Scott's exhausted brain. He approached Captain Vance. "Captain, I think I know how to get Janus to spill his guts, but I need the Crithians." Vance arched an eyebrow, but nodded. "All right, try it. We need any edge we can get." Scott and Xeric entered the brig, Janus glowering at them from behind a force field. Scott leaned in close. "We know about the pheromones, Janus, the mind control." Janus scoffed. "What nonsense is this?" Xeric stepped forward, his carapace glistening. "We Crithians have ways of influencing the minds of lesser species. Subtle, undetectable. You've been serving us all along." Scott smiled coldly. "Do we? Think about it, Janus. The Crithian workers, always there in the background, watching, waiting, whispering in your mind." A flicker of doubt danced in Janus's eyes. No, I would know." "Would you?" Xeric's mandibles clicked. "The beauty of our influence is that you never even realize it's happening." Scott leaned back, letting the seed of paranoia take root. He could see the uncertainty eating away at Janus's resolve. The Adosian's will was cracking. Suddenly alarms blared throughout the ship. Scott and Xeric rushed to the bridge, Janus's shouts fading behind them. Captain Vance stood at the viewport, her face pale. "We're too late. The Adosians are already here." Scott stared in horror at the scene before them. The human outpost hung in space, its once gleaming hull pocked with scars and boiling explosions. A swarm of Adosian warships surrounded it, pouring fire into the beleaguered station. Scott's mind raced. They had to do something, anything. Then it hit him, a desperate, crazy gamble. But it was all they had. He turned to Vance, eyes blazing with determination. "Captain, I have an idea, but it's going to sound insane." Minutes later, Scott stood in the hangar bay, a small team of human and Crithian volunteers at his side. Janus, unbound but flanked by armed guards, glared at them suspiciously. "The human outpost is under attack," Scott said, letting urgency color his voice. "We need to get this information to them." He held up a data drive. "The frigate can't get close enough, but a small, fast shuttle might." Janus sneered. And you're trusting me with this after all that's happened? Scott met his gaze steadily. We're out of options, and despite everything, I believe you care about your people. You don't want this war any more than we do. Janus hesitated, suspicion warring with resolve. And if I refuse? Scott shrugged. Then we try anyway, and a lot of people, Idosian and human, die needlessly. A tense beat. Then Janus straightened, reaching for the data drive. I'll do it. Scott handed it over, his fingers brushing the hidden tracking device he'd planted on the casing. Good luck. Moments later, the shuttle blasted out of the hangar, Janus at the controls. Scott watched it go, his heart pounding. The bait was set, now to see if the trap would spring. On the frigate's bridge, Scott and Vance watched the sensor display, the shuttle's tracking signal a pulsing dot. It wove through the battle, dodging fire from both sides, before suddenly angling away from the outpost, straight toward the largest Idosian ship, the Dreadnought. Vance nodded grimly. He's taken the bait. Helm, pursuit course, keep us out of sensor range. It was massive, easily dwarfing the frigate. Its hull bristled with gun emplacements and missile ports, a floating fortress of destruction. We'll never get through those defenses, Vance muttered. But Scott just grinned fiercely as Janus's shuttle approached the Dreadnought unopposed. We don't have to. We've got our ticket right there. The stolen shuttle broadcast its Idosian IFF signal, the Dreadnought's defense grid recognizing it as friendly. It slipped past the outer screen, angling for the main hangar bay. Vance nodded to her crew. Launch assault pods. From the frigate's underside, a dozen small ships shot out on plumes of drive flame. Heavily armed and armored, each carried a hand-picked team of human commandos and Crithian saboteurs. The pods raced after Janus's shuttle, matching speed and trajectory. As the Dreadnought's hangar doors yawned open to admit the shuttle, the pods slipped in behind it, undetected in its sensor shadow. Scott, sealed in combat armor, gripped his rifle as the pod shuddered around him. Xeric crouched across from him, razor-edged blades extending from his forearms. With a bone-jarring thud, the pod slammed into the hangar deck, hatches blasting open. Scott and his team leaped out, weapons spitting fire, as Idosian soldiers shouted in alarm and scrambled for cover. Janus stood to one side, eyes wide with shock and betrayal, as the humans and Crithians charged past him. Scott had time for a single grim nod before he was past, pounding down the corridor. Acknowledgements crackled back as the strike teams split up, racing through the massive ship. Scott led the charge towards the Dreadnought's command center, blasting through bulkheads and mowing down Idosian defenders. In the maze-like bowels of the ship, the Crithians scuttled through ventilation ducts and maintenance tunnels, their compact bodies perfectly suited for the claustrophobic spaces. They planted demolition charges at key structural points, mandibles twitching with grim satisfaction. Scott and his team burst onto the bridge, plasma bolts stitching the air. Idosian officers fell, sizzling holes punched through their armor. Scott leaped over a command console, slamming an Idosian down with a vicious rifle butt to the head. He slapped a data drive into the port, his fingers flying over the controls. Uploading the virus now! In the computer core deep within the ship, sleeper code unfurled from the drive, worming its way through the Dreadnought systems. One by one, consoles went dark, screens flickering with gibberish. The ship's weapons fell silent, engines sputtered and died, comms dissolved into static. The virus rampaged through the fleet's network, infecting every ship. The Idosian fleet was dead in space. All teams fall back to the pods, Scott yelled into his comm. Humans and Crithians disengaged, fighting desperate rearguard actions as they fell back through the corridors. Idosian resistance intensified as the crew realized the danger, but it was too late. The teams piled into their assault pods, Crithian fingers flying over the controls. As the pods blasted free of the Dreadnought, the Crithians spoke a single word into their comms. Detonate! The charges they had planted throughout the ship exploded in a rippling cascade of destruction. Blast doors crumpled, bulkheads collapsed. The reactor containment failed with a blinding pulse of light. The mighty dreadnought shuddered, explosions marching along its length. Cracks raced across the hull, venting atmosphere and bodies into the void. With a final titanic blast, the ship ripped apart, a miniature sun blooming in the heart of the Adocian fleet. Cheers erupted throughout the pods as the dreadnought's destruction threw the Adocians into chaos. Aboard the beleaguered outpost, weary human defenders stared in amazement as the Adocian barrage faltered. Then, with a roar of engines, the human frigate plunged into the heart of the enemy fleet, railguns and missile batteries hammering at the disorganized Adocians. The outpost's own guns, sensing weakness, redoubled their efforts. Caught between the frigate's vengeful fury and the outpost's desperate stand, the Adocian fleet crumpled. Ships broke and ran, some falling to the human guns, others limping away into hyperspace. Within minutes it was over. The outpost, battered but unbroken, hung in space amid a spreading field of debris that had once been their would-be conquerors. Scott and his team, flush with victory, returned to the frigate to a hero's welcome. In the hangar bay, humans and Crithians alike cheered their return, Captain Vance waiting with a proud smile. But even as he shook hands and clapped shoulders, Scott couldn't shake a niggling doubt. It had all been too easy. Janus, the dreadnought, the invasion. It felt orchestrated, like they had been meant to win. He thought of Janus's final knowing smirk as he fled the dreadnought ahead of the explosions. The Adocian had known something Scott and the others didn't. And deep in his gut, Scott knew this was far from over. The Adocians had been defeated but not destroyed. Janus had been captured, but he was a pawn, not a mastermind. Earth had won the battle, but the war Scott feared was just beginning. As he stared out the viewport at the stars, Scott's jaw clenched with grim resolve. Whatever came next, whatever enemy lurked in the shadows, he would be ready. Humanity would be ready. They had just proven that no matter the odds, no matter the foe, humans would never stop fighting, never stop struggling, never stop clawing their way to victory. The galaxy had just learned a harsh lesson. Don't fuck with humans unless you want your shit absolutely wrecked. And Scott would be there to make sure that lesson stuck, no matter what. Scott stared at the glowing data screens, his eyes burning from exhaustion. Captain Vance stood beside him, her face grim as she took in the information scrolling before them. The data they'd recovered from the Adocian command ship painted a chilling picture. The Obsidian Council, Scott muttered, his jaw clenching. They've been behind everything, pulling the strings, manipulating conflicts across the galaxy. Scott's fists clenched. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. The Adocians' attempted invasion of human space was just one move in a much larger game. And we have to stop them, he said, his voice hard. Expose their machinations, dismantle their power structure. It's the only way to ensure humanity's safety. Hell, the safety of every free species in the galaxy. Vance turned to him, her eyes calculating. We'll need hard evidence. Concrete proof of the Council's activities that we can broadcast on every frequency. Scott nodded, his mind racing. The Crithians, they have contacts, informants across a dozen systems. If anyone can help us infiltrate Adocian space and gather intel, it's them. Vance considered for a moment, then nodded. Make it happen. I'll start quietly assembling a team trustworthy, skilled, and absolutely loyal. As Scott strode from the room, already composing a message to Zyrek, Vance called after him. And Scott, we're going to need a ship. Something fast, stealthy, and heavily armed. I think I know just the person who can help with that. 2 days later, Scott found himself in a dimly lit tavern on the seedy outskirts of a frontier space station. The air was thick with the acrid scent of cheap liquor and the murmurs of a dozen alien languages. Across the table, Rax Ortega leaned back in his chair, a rakish grin on his face. The Zephyrian smuggler had a reputation for being one of the best pilots in the sector, with a ship that could outrun anything the Adocians could throw at it. So let me get this straight, Rax drawled, his fingertips steepled. You want to borrow my ship and my crew for a little jaunt into the heart of Adocian space. On some half-cocked mission to take down their government? Scott leaned forward, his voice low. Not just their government, a shadow council that's been manipulating wars and conflicts across the galaxy. We need your help, Rax, and in return, you'll get a cut of any valuable intel we uncover along the way. Scott nodded, relief and anticipation mingling in his gut. Understood, we'll be ready. As they stood to leave, Scott's wristcom chimed. He glanced down, frowning at the message scrolling across the small screen. An anonymous message, Scott replied, his brow furrowed. Someone claiming to have information about the Obsidian Council wants to meet on some remote planetoid in the Oort cloud. Rax snorted. Smells like a trap. Scott nodded slowly. Probably, but if there's even a chance this informant is legit, we have to check it out. Rax sighed, draining the last of his drink. All right, but I'm coming with. If it is a trap, you'll need backup. 3 days later, Rax's sleek ship, the Nebula's Edge, sliced through the inky void, approaching a small, rocky planetoid. Scott stood on the bridge, suited up for hostile environment, his pulse rifle slung across his back. Scanning the landing coordinates now, Rax reported from the pilot's seat. I'm not picking up any other ships or energy signatures. If your mystery informant is here, they're keeping a low profile. Scott nodded, the unease in his gut growing. Bring us in, nice and slow, passive scans only. The Nebula's Edge settled onto the planetoid's barren surface, kicking up plumes of grey dust. Scott and Rax disembarked, joined by a heavily armed Crithian named Zix and 2 of Rax's crew, a burly human named Mac and a lithe Zephyrian woman named Lyra. As they approached the meeting coordinates, a shallow canyon winding between towering basalt cliffs, Scott held up a fist, signaling the team to halt. Something wasn't right. Ambush, he yelled, diving for cover just as a hail of blaster fire erupted from the rocks above. The team scattered, taking cover behind boulders and outcroppings. Scott rolled to his knees, bringing his pulse rifle to bear. He squeezed off a burst of shots, the plasma bolts sizzling through the air. A figure stepped out onto the cliff edge, a figure Scott had hoped to never see again. Janus grinned down at them, his body encased in sleek black armor, his eyes glowing an eerie red. "Did you really think I would perish so easily, human?" Janus called down, his voice amplified by external speakers. "The Obsidian Council has granted me new life, new purpose, and the chance to offer you a choice." Scott snarled, firing another burst at Janus. The shots deflected off a shimmering energy shield, dissipating harmlessly. "Join us, Scott," Janus continued, unfazed. "Join the Council. With your skills, your knowledge, you could have power beyond imagining. Wealth, influence, the chance to shape the galaxy itself." Scott spat, disgusted. "And what? Sell out my species? Become a puppet like you? Never." Janus shrugged, almost regretfully. "Then you will die, along with every last member of your pitiful race." With a gesture, Janus signaled his troops. Dozens of heavily armed mercenaries poured over the cliffs, dropping to the canyon floor with jetpacks and grappling lines. The battle was joined, blaster fire crisscrossing the canyon in a deadly web. Scott and his team fought with desperate ferocity, downing mercenary after mercenary. But Janus was a force of nature, his cybernetically enhanced body moving with blurring speed and precision. He waded through the chaos, energy blades flashing, cutting down Rax's crew members with ruthless efficiency. Scott found himself driven back, separated from his team. He scrambled up a narrow path, pulse rifle blazing, trying to gain some high ground. Janus was right behind him, bounding up the cliff face like a demonic spider. Scott reached a small plateau, whirling to face his pursuer. And then Janus was on him, energy blades clashing against Scott's rifle. They fought across the plateau, the ground crumbling away mere feet from a dizzying drop. Scott was outmatched, and he knew it. Janus was faster, stronger, a fusion of Idosian ruthlessness and cold machine logic. But Scott had something else, a desperate human fury born of a need to protect his people. In a last desperate gamble, Scott lunged forward, dropping his rifle and seizing Janus's armored wrists. The energy blade sizzled mere inches from his face as he strained against the Adosian's inhuman strength. Scott's foot slipped, sending them both tumbling to the very edge of the cliff. Locked together, they teetered on the brink. With a roar of effort, Scott heaved, twisting his body. For a split second, Janus's balance faltered, his weight shifting just a hair too far back. They plunged over the edge, Janus's scream of rage and disbelief ringing in Scott's ears. At the last moment, Scott kicked away, his hand snagging an outcropping of rock. He hung there, gasping, as Janus plummeted away, vanishing into the mists below. Far below, the sounds of battle faded, leaving an eerie silence. Slowly, painfully, Scott hauled himself back up onto the plateau. He lay there for a long moment, his breath coming in ragged gasps, every muscle screaming in protest. The crunch of gravel made him lift his head. Rax stood there, his face streaked with soot, his armor pitted and scarred. But he was alive. Beside him, Zix emerged, one arm hanging limp, but mandibles twitching in a grim smile. "The mercenaries are dead or scattered," Rax reported, helping Scott to his feet. "Looks like your pal Janus is too." Scott shook his head, wincing as his bruised ribs protested. "No, he's not dead. Something that angry, that driven? It'll take more than a long fall to put him down for good." Rax frowned. "Then what now?" Scott looked out over the cliff's edge, to the stars glimmering above. Somewhere out there, the Obsidian Council was weaving its webs, plotting against humanity and every other free species in the galaxy. "Now," Scott said, his voice hard, "we take the fight to them. We find the Council, we expose them, and we burn them down, no matter what it takes." He turned to his battered team, resolve etched into every line of his face. "Rest up and reload. We're heading into the heart of Adosian space, and we're not coming back until the job is done." They limped back to the nebula's edge, leaving the blasted canyon behind. As the ship lifted off, Scott stared out the viewscreen, Janus's final words echoing in his mind. The Obsidian Council had revealed themselves, had shown their hand, but Scott knew this was just the beginning. They wouldn't stop, wouldn't rest, until humanity was ground beneath their heel. But Scott and his team would be there to meet them, to fight them in the shadows and the light, as long as it took, whatever the cost. For this was a war now, a secret war fought in the darkness between the stars, and it was a war Scott intended to win. The nebula's edge sliced through the inky void, the stars blurring into streaks of light as the ship hurtled through hyperspace. On the bridge, Scott stood over a holographic display, his brow furrowed in concentration. Rax leaned against a bulkhead, his arms crossed, while Zurich and the other Crithians clustered around the display. "There," Scott said, pointing to a pulsing red dot on the star map. "That's where the trail leads, the Obsidian Citadel." Rax let out a low whistle. "That's a hell of a fortress, bristling with guns, shielded to the teeth. How do we get in?" Scott zoomed in on the map, revealing a network of tunnels beneath the Citadel's surface. "Every fortress has a weakness. We'll infiltrate through these old mining shafts, come up right beneath their feet." Zyrek clicked his mandibles. A dangerous plan, but it could work. Hours later, the nebula's edge drifted in the shadow of a shattered moon, its engines powered down to avoid detection. Scott, Rax, Zyrek, and a hand-picked team of Crithian warriors gathered in the airlock, checking their weapons and sealing their armor. The airlock cycled open, revealing the pockmarked surface of the moon. The team moved out, bounding across the low-gravity landscape towards a gaping mine shaft. They descended into the depths, the only light coming from the glow of their suit lamps. The tunnels twisted and turned, leading them deep into the moon's core. Scott consulted his map, guiding them through the labyrinth. Finally, they emerged into a vast cavern, a massive Idosian transport ship looming above them. "That's our ride," Scott whispered. "Once we're aboard, we'll be able to slip right into the Citadel's hangar." They moved quickly, scaling the transport's landing gear and cutting their way into its cargo hold. As the ship lifted off, Scott and his team hid among the crates and containers, waiting for their moment to strike. The transport shuddered as it docked with the Obsidian Citadel. As the cargo bay doors ground open, Scott and his team burst from cover, weapons blazing. They cut down the surprised Idosian guards, their cries of alarm lost in the cacophony of battle. Scott led the charge into the citadel proper, following the map he had memorized. They moved through the corridors like ghosts, avoiding patrols and security cameras. Finally, they reached their target, the council chamber. The massive doors swung open, revealing a cavernous room filled with shadowy figures. At the center, a towering hologram flickered and danced, the image of a swirling, malevolent void. "Brothers and sisters," a voice boomed, "the time of the void is at hand. Soon all life will be consumed, and we shall ascend to a higher plane of existence." Scott felt his blood run cold. This was no mere conspiracy. It was a cult dedicated to the destruction of everything. He stepped forward, his weapon raised. "It's over. Surrender now, and you might just live to see a trial." The figures turned, their eyes glowing with fanatical light. "The unbeliever," one hissed. "He must not interfere with the void's ascension." The cultists surged forward, drawing weapons from their robes. Scott and his team met them head-on, plasma bolts and razor-sharp blades flashing in the dim light. It was a desperate, brutal fight. The cultists fought with the fervor of the truly insane, heedless of their own lives. Scott saw Crithians fall, their green blood splattering the floor. Rax took a blade to the shoulder, but fought on, his face a mask of pain and rage. They pushed forward, inch by bloody inch, until they stood before the hologram of the void. The cult's leaders formed a ring around it, chanting in some guttural alien tongue. The cultist lowered his hood, and Scott felt the world tilt beneath his feet. He knew that face. It was a face from his past, a face he had long thought dead. "Hello, Scott," the man said, a cruel smile playing across his lips. "It's been a long time." The man spread his hands. "The void called to me, Scott. It showed me the truth. All life is fleeting, meaningless. Only in the embrace of the void can we find true purpose." Scott shook his head, anger and betrayal warring in his heart. "You're insane. I won't let you destroy everything we've fought for." The man's smile widened. "You can't stop it, Scott. The void is coming. It hungers for all life, all light, and we shall feast with it." The cultists began to chant louder, the hologram of the void pulsing and growing. Scott could feel it, a cold, inexorable presence pressing against his mind. He looked to Rax, to Xeric, to the battered remnants of his team. They nodded, grim determination etched on their faces. They knew what had to be done. As one, they opened fire, pouring plasma bolts and grenades into the void's hologram, into the chanting cultists. The man who had once been Scott's friend died with a look of rapture on his face, his body shredded by the barrage. The hologram flickered, wavered, then exploded in a burst of black light. The cultists screamed as the void's power tore through them, reducing them to ash and dust. Scott and his team ran, racing through the crumbling corridors of the citadel. The fortress shook and heaved around them, the void's death throes tearing it apart. They burst into the hangar, fighting their way through the panicked Idosian guards. Rax's ship was where they had left it, its engines already humming with power. They leaped aboard, Xeric slamming the hatch shut behind them. Rax threw himself into the pilot's seat, his hands flying over the controls. The nebula's edge roared out of the hangar, engines straining as it clawed for open space. Behind them, the obsidian citadel buckled and collapsed, imploding in on itself in a blinding flash of light. The shockwave caught them, sending the ship tumbling end over end. Rax fought with the controls, teeth gritted as he tried to stabilize their flight. Finally, the ship righted itself, the stars once again steady points of light beyond the viewport. Scott slumped against a bulkhead, exhaustion and grief washing over him. They had won. The Obsidian Council was destroyed, the void banished back to whatever hell it had come from. But the cost had been high. Too high. Scott looked around the battered interior of the ship, at the faces of the survivors. Xeric, his exoskeleton cracked and oozing. Rax, his shoulder a mass of burnt flesh and melted armor. The handful of Crithians, their numbers so reduced from when they had started this mission. And the empty seats, the spaces where friends and comrades should have been. The loss hit Scott like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs. He staggered to the view screen, staring out at the stars. Somewhere out there the void still lurked, weakened, diminished, but not destroyed. And as long as it existed, there would be those who sought its power, who craved the oblivion it offered. The fight wasn't over. Scott knew that now. It might never be over. As long as humanity faced the darkness, as long as they stood against the tide of annihilation, there would always be another battle to fight. But for now, at least, they had won. They had shown the galaxy the true strength of the human spirit, the indomitable will that refused to bow or break. No matter the cost. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.